Hello, everyone, and welcome to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together about 60,000 medical professionals from 107 affiliated national movements worldwide. And today on ICMDA webinars, we're looking at the subject of how Christianity shaped science. And this is how it works. We've got Dr. Michael Jones speaking to us, and I'll introduce him fairly shortly. But he will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have a time of question and answer. So Christianity was crucial for the development of modern science, but there are many modern myths about how we developed modern science, and many today think that science developed in spite of Christianity, but actually the opposite is true, as we're going to hear. Modern science has borrowed numerous principles from Christianity and is actually built on a Christian worldview foundation. And to speak to us today, we're privileged to have Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. Michael is the founder and director of the nonprofit organization Inspiring Philosophy and is primarily dedicated to research in the fields of philosophy, history, and science to uncover deep philosophical questions relating to the universe and our individual perception of life. He has a master's in philosophy from the University of Arizona and is broadcasting from the Pacific side of the US this morning, so very early there. He's published a plethora of research work, which is readily available on his quite extraordinary YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy. And on this channel, he compiles and analyzes data for the layman to reach reasonable conclusions to a variety of philosophical quandaries. So, Michael, such a pleasure to have you here today, and we're so grateful for your time. We look forward to hearing you and interacting with you afterwards in the Q&A. Over to you, brother. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having me. I always enjoy giving this talk because it is a huge misconception that people have about the origins of science. We are constantly told that religion and specifically Christianity is holding back science, and nothing could be further from the truth. We probably wouldn't have modern science if it wasn't for Christianity. And this is the consensus of modern historians of science. So oftentimes you'll talk to scientists in academia, and they'll be very disparaging of Christianity, as I'm sure many of you have encountered throughout your careers. But if you talk to historians of science, they'll tell you a different story. So this is a presentation I give. It's based on a video I'm currently working, which will be even longer and give even more data, which should be up on my channel in October. And it will be titled How Christianity Created Science. But so let's go through this. So the first thing I want to say is I'm not saying Christianity is solely responsible for science. Anytime I bring this up, this is what people will say. Yeah, but Greek philosophy contributed. Yeah, but economic developments contributed. Very true. Christianity was not the only thing that gave rise to science, but it was crucial for the rise of modern science, for sure. And so that's what we're going to cover. Now, typically, I'll see this passed around the internet. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. It's a supposed timeline showing scientific advancements. And everything was going well until the Christian Dark Ages happened and set everything back. And then the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment and then modern science sent us into the future. And the implication is if it wasn't for Christianity, we would be exploring the stars right now. If that stupid Dark Ages. Well, I'm here to tell you today that the Christian Dark Ages never happened. It's a myth. It is a myth invented by people who are not historians. So, for example, David Hutchings and James Ungariano say, it seems that the Dark Ages were not that dark after all. It becomes clear that medieval intellectuals were not only rational, they were hyper-rational. To them, logic was the single most important tool for the investigation of the natural world. Similarly, James Hannam says in his book, Roger Collins, in his standard work, Early Medieval Europe, 300 to 1,000 states. The centuries covered by the book constitute a period of the greatest significance for the future development, not only of Europe, but in the longer term of much else of the world. So little credence does Dr. Collins give to the term Dark Ages that he does not even bother to mention that. He refuses to use it. So Dark Ages didn't exist, according to the historians. Let me give one more quote. This historian says, as a medievalist, I'm asked all the times, why was it called the Dark Ages? The phrase comes up a few times in history, and it means something different every time. Dark Ages usually refers to the 900 years of European history between the 5th and 14th century. Have you heard that this was a period of stalled advancements in science or culture? That's just a myth. So what we're basically finding out is that there was no Christian Dark Ages that held back science. In fact, this was actually a time of advancement. And if we didn't go through this period, we would not have advanced into the modern era. This is a great book called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths about science and religion. And every chapter has a different author. And some of the myths are that the rise of Christianity was responsible for the demise of ancient science. The myth that the medieval church suppressed the growth of science. The myth that the medieval church taught that the earth was flat. The myth that the medieval church prohibited human dissection. That's completely false, as we'll cover more in a bit. Another myth is that Giordano Bruno was the first martyr of modern science. Again, didn't happen that way. The myth that Galileo was imprisoned and tortured for advancing Copernicanism. Again, another myth that did not occur. The myth that the scientific revolution liberated science from religion. And the myth that the church denounced anesthesia in childbirth on biblical grounds. So they basically say there's all these myths out in the current modern world that are just completely false. In the book, Noah J. Efron has a great chapter. The title of the chapter is The Myth That Christianity Gave Birth to Modern Science. So it sounds like a pretty disparaging chapter title, but the actual chapter is pointing out something I already said earlier, which is that Christianity was not the only thing that gave rise to modern science. So he wants to note that there were other factors. But he even says this. He says, generations of historians and sociologists have discovered many ways in which Christians, Christian beliefs, and Christian institutions played crucial roles in fashioning the tenets, methods, and institutions of what in time became modern science. Today, almost all historians agree that Christianity, Catholicism, as well as Protestantism, moved many early modern intellectuals to study nature systematically. Historians have also found that notions borrowed from Christian belief found their ways into scientific discourse with glorious results. The very notion that nature is lawful, some scholars argue, was borrowed from Christian theology. So where did the myth come from that Christianity was held back science? Well, it comes from these two guys, Andrew Dickson White and John William Draper. And they put forward what historians call the conflict thesis. It was the thesis that there has been a continued hostile relationship between science and religion. And one of their goals was to establish a university without a religious affiliation, which in the U.S. is called Cornell University. At that time, most universities were established with a religious affiliation, and they wanted one that was purely secular. So they created this thesis that there's been this horrible conflict between science and religion, and they had a great marketing campaign because they really got this data out there. They really got this thesis out there that there's this conflict between religion and science, and they convinced a ton of people. The problem is today is that historians unanimously reject this thesis. It's not even considered serious by historians today. It's just overwhelmingly rejected. And here are some books that have covered this, exploring how science and religion have actually worked well together throughout the medieval period. Here's one quote. While some historians have always regarded the Draper-White thesis as oversimplifying and distorting a complex relationship, in the late 20th century, it underwent a more systematic reevaluation. The result is the growing recognition among historians of science that the relationship of religion and science has been much more positive than is sometimes thought. Another quote, John Hillebrand, who is no friend to the Catholic Church, but he says the Roman Catholic Church gave more financial and social support to the study of astronomy for over 6 centuries, from the recovery of ancient learning during the late medieval ages into the Enlightenment, than any other and probably all other institutions. Now, let's talk about some of these historical myths. So maybe you've heard this one. We are told that everyone believed that heavier objects fell faster than lighter objects until Galileo went up to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, dropped 2 objects down, one heavy, one light, and they fell at the same speed, and the world was shocked. Well, not exactly accurate. This was already disproved about 1,000 years earlier. So in Genesis of Science, Jane Hannam says this. It says, the earliest record we have of someone categorically rejecting this is from the work of John Philoponus back in the 6th century. He wrote, if you let fall from the same height 2 weights, one of which is many times heavier than the other, you will see that the relative times required for the drop does not depend on their relative weights, but that the difference in time is taken as very small. In this passage, Philoponus is clearly referring to an experiment that he has tried himself. So early on, so like in the 500s, they were basically showing that, that we can easily see that heavier objects don't fall faster than lighter objects. Here's another interesting thing. Now, St. Augustine, he was not a scientist, but he did something quite interesting. He said this, they say that the legend that the peacock's bird meat did not go moldy was hardly a new one. It had circulated among the ancient Greeks. Augustine, however, didn't take their word for it. He said, this property, when I first heard of it, seemed to me incredible, but it happened at Carthage that a bird of this kind was cooked and served up to me. Taking a suitable slice of flesh from its breast, I ordered it to be kept. And when it had been kept as many days as make any other flesh stinking, it was produced and set before me, and emitted no offensive smell. And after it had been laid by for 30 days or more, it was still in the same state. And a year after, the same still, except that it was a little more shriveled and drier. Now, Hutchings and Ungariano add to this. They say any biologist, chemist, or physicist worth their salt would immediately recognize the passage above for precisely what it is, a fully fledged and surprisingly modern science experiment. Many popular historians of science suggest that experiments of this form only first appeared in the 1600s with the likes of Galileo and Boyle and Hooke. Yet here we are around AD 420, and Augustine has beaten them to the lot. He has a hypothesis. He has a method. He has data. He has a conclusion. By referencing other meats, he has even built in a control variable of sorts. So he was a theologian primarily, but here he is doing something which we could call a proto-science experiment very early on. And he's just one of the leading theologians throughout Christian history. And here he is doing things that scientists would applaud. Let's talk about some figures. I mentioned John Philoponus. He studied philosophy, physics, cosmology, theology, grammar. He challenged and corrected Aristotle on a number of things, which in the ancient Greco-Roman world was unheard of. You don't challenge the great philosopher, but Philoponus was fine doing it. He rejected Aristotle's idea that motion required a continuous external force. Aristotle put this idea that air is sort of pushing things. That's how they move. We know that's kind of ridiculous because air is resistant. It causes resistance. Philoponus proposed that a moving object receives an internal impetus from an initial force, which keeps it in motion until dissipated. Okay, this concept prefigures medieval impetus theory in Newton's first law of motion. So very early on, they were already discussing these ideas. Another guy in the East, Leo the mathematician, so he was in the Byzantine era. He studied mathematics, Aristotelian logic, astronomy, medicine. He was the first to introduce numbers instead of letters in arithmetic and algebra. He preserved the works of Archimedes and others. He also composed his own medical encyclopedia. And his school developed a smaller and more efficient script that took up less space and that could be copied quicker. So he really helped his school helped for more texts to be copied and preserved. Bede the Venerable. He studied history, time, astronomy, cosmology, classic theology. He wrote an ecclesiastical history of the English people. He also wrote about natural phenomena like the tides, showing an early scientific curiosity grounded in observation. Now, real quick on this one note, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, Pliny the Elder argued that they were trying to figure out why fresh water and salt water, why there was a difference there. And so Pliny actually argued that there were underwater tunnels. So fresh water would go into the sea, go into these underwater tunnels, and go back to their sources. And Bede was like, well, that's ridiculous. And because he investigated and he found that fresh water floats on top of salt water. So that has to be false. So yet he's doing scientific observations and investigations as far back as the 600s and 700s. Here are some early natural philosophers from the first millennium. As you can see on here, there's a pope listed, Pope Sylvester II. If the Catholic Church was so against science, why did they turn a scientist into the pope at a point? Here are some other ones from the second one. And this is just a very small list. There are so many more I could list. But what I really want to get into is how Christianity helped science. That is important. So here are specific doctrines I want to cover that modern science has borrowed from Christianity. The first is the concept of monotheism. We believe in an omnipotent God who created the universe, which is governed by his natural laws. Cultures that believe the world was governed by many gods tended to think of the world as unpredictable and chaotic and as a product of supernatural chaos. So Hutchings and Ungariano say, by contrast, monotheism gave rise to one of the cornerstones of modern science, the belief that an experiment conducted on Monday will give results that are still usable on a Tuesday, since the same God is in total control of the universe. In other words, when you believe in one God who controls everything, you don't believe gods are fighting, you can trust that nature is going to be the same, and that allows you to conduct experiments and expect regularity in natural law. Mark Worthing says, one might think that monotheism, especially those forms with strong affirmations of God's sovereignty, would have been little different to polytheism. Didn't monotheism simply roll up the function of various competing deities into one package? But this is not what happened. In most cases, belief in one God, especially an all-powerful, all-knowing sovereign God, led people to look increasingly to natural causes. An all-powerful sovereign God, while certainly capable of intervention, indeed of miracle, would create and govern the world in such a way as to ordinarily follow regular and therefore comprehensive patterns. But it's not just a monotheistic God. We also need a rational creator. And the God of the Bible is one of order and rationality. He keeps his covenants, and his words and decrees are binding. He's reasonable. He doesn't change his mind. Therefore, his creation should also be reasonable and orderly. Take verses like Genesis 8:22, where God makes a covenant with nature. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. But we also know from Deuteronomy 7, know therefore that the Lord your God is a God, the faithful God, who keeps covenants and steadfast love with those who endure him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. Psalm 105, he remembers his covenant forever, his word, the word that he commanded for 1,000 generations. In other words, when God made a covenant with nature, we can trust that it's going to stay the same. He doesn't change. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today as forever, as Hebrews 13:8 says. So what we see is that we can trust that what God set up with nature, he's not going to change his mind in 100 years. We can expect that we can study nature and understand that things will be the same regardless if one generation does it or of another generation. So again, we have regularity and continuation of natural laws thanks to doctrines we get from Christianity. Now, Christianity actually also removed old dogmas and old limits. Let me read you a quote. Something happened in the 1200s is that the Bishop of Paris banned the works of Aristotle. And many anti-religious writers will say this is evidence that the church was anti-science. They banned Aristotle. How could they do this? But the historian Edward Grant says there's a lot more nuance here. He says the most significant aspect of the condemnation of 1277 was not the condemnation of Aristotle's offensive ideas about Christian doctrine, but rather the condemnation of his ideas that seemed to limit God's absolute power to do whatever he pleased short of a logical contradiction. They firmly believed that for God, Aristotle's natural impossibilities were all supernaturally impossible. In other words, Aristotle's God was too limited, and they didn't want Aristotle's ideas to put limits on what scientists or natural philosophers, as they were called at the time, were doing and what could study. They wanted them to be free to study all possibilities, so they had this idea to ban Aristotle. Now, the ban didn't last long, and it wasn't like global. It wasn't across Europe, for example. But this was the reasoning behind it, surprisingly. So the church was actually less dogmatic and more open-minded than Aristotle. All possibilities should be kept on the table, since God could logically do whatever he wanted. Christian dogma, rather than restricting science, allowed it to open up to new possibilities never contemplated before. Another important aspect is the effect of desiring God. The Bible talks about that we should desire God, that we should seek him out. But Romans 1:20 says, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. In other words, if we desire to know about God, we can learn about him by studying nature, which was very different than all other religious traditions like Far East or like Islam or the ancient pagans, for example. We're told that if we want to know more about God, we can find more about him by studying nature. And that should just give rise to science in and of itself. Margaret Osler says the Bible was a powerful source of teleological thinking. According to the Old Testament tradition, God created the world ex nihilo by his power and will. His wisdom and power are evident in the creation. A biblical verse frequently quoted by early modern natural philosophers proclaims, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. So biblical theology led to the idea that we could know more about God by studying his creation. Christians throughout the centuries have desired to know more about God and believe they could by just studying what he did. This was behind the work of, if you read, for example, like Johannes Kepler, he was very much into this. He's very much, I want to know more about God, and I do that by studying and doing science. Now, also a very important doctrine is the Imago Dei, the image of God. This was crucial for the development of science. If God is reasonable and we are like him, then we should also be reasonable. And we can understand what he has made and how he has made it. And we have the rational capacity to discover his laws. Here's a quote from Johannes Kepler himself. He says, for the theater of the world is so ordered that there exists in its suitable signs by which human minds, likenesses of God, are not only invited to study the divine works, for which they may evaluate the founder's goodness, but are also assisted in inquiring more deeply. So because we're like God and he's rational, we can also be rational and we can discover what God has created and what he has done and what his laws are. This is very different than a lot of other religious traditions in the world. A lot of other religious traditions don't have the Imago Dei, even in something like Islam or Far Eastern religions. But it's not just that we are the Imago Dei. We also have a fallen nature. Again, the fall is very specific to Christianity. Other religious traditions lack the fall. Now, if we are fallen, our logic and reason are still useful, but they're marred. They offer no guarantee of the truth on their own. Therefore, we need to do repeated experimentation to verify results. This is where the scientific method comes out of. Historians are pretty unanimous on this as far as what I have seen. So Noah J. Efron said Augustine's notion of original sin was embraced by advocates of experimental natural philosophy. As they saw it, fallen humans lack the grace to understand the workings of the world through cognition alone, requiring in their disgraced state painstaking experiment and observation. In this way, Christian doctrine lent urgency to experimentation. Peter Harrison says, in short, in order to recover the knowledge of nature lost as a consequence of the fall and to regain our dominion over natural things, we presently need special measures to overcome our fallen conditions. These are provided by the kind of experimental science practiced by the Royal Society. So in other words, because of the Imago Dei and the fallen nature, these two things working together, they gave rise to this scientific method. And this is why this came out of Christian Europe and not any other area of the world or religious tradition. You know what also helped give rise to science? Our complicated theology. Christianity contains doctrines that are hard for human minds to comprehend, things like the Trinity, incarnation, the Eucharist. Christians had to explore new and old ideas to find ways to make these doctrines make sense. So Edward Grant says certain aspects of their religion may also have drawn Christians to Greek philosophy. One example is the problem of the Eucharist, with its difficulties about the nature of substances and their attributes. Adoption of the Trinitarian position placed enormous metaphysical burdens on Christianity. Once Jesus was perceived as the Son of God, the problems of expounding the nature of the Godhead were formidable indeed. To help explain such theological difficulties, scholars deemed the concepts and terminology of Greek metaphysics essential. Logic was also considered important. Islam was much less driven by inherent theological needs to seek out Greek philosophy than was Christianity. Indeed, Islamic theologians discouraged analyses of the Quran and prevented the development of a speculative theology. Latin Christianity provided a systematic environment for the sustenance and advance of natural philosophy and science. In other words, Christians were studying things. How do we explain the Trinity? So they delve into logic. They delved into Greek philosophy. Sometimes they'd invent new terms, and then this spilled over into their study of the natural world. So it's almost like God knew what he was doing when he revealed things that were not so super clear. They made us want to study things more. It kind of was like, well, now we need to study God more. We need to study his world more to find out what he means by this. And it actually encouraged the growth of science. It's almost like God knew what he was doing. Another important aspect is the separation of church and state. This is unique to the Christian tradition. It comes from Jesus' line, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, render to God the things that are God. Christianity developed this idea of separate institutions. And one of these ideas was the two books. We have the book of nature and the book of scripture. And these are supposed to go hand in hand. They're both God's revealed books. Science was allowed to develop without being constrained by theology. Edward Grant says, positive feelings towards natural philosophy may have inadvertently have been fostered by the Christian attitude towards the state, exemplified in Jesus' call to render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Although many Christian churchmen, such as St. Augustine, proclaimed the superiority of the church over the state, the Christian church did acknowledge and accept the separation of church and state, which allowed for the development of a secularly oriented natural philosophy. In medieval Islam, by contrast, truly secular government was absent, and the church and state were one. James Hannam notes that out of this, Christian Europe developed universities. He says the schools of Alexandria and Constantinople were both royal foundations that depended on the whim of the monarch for money and patronage. In contrast, the new universities of Western Europe enjoyed a special kind of status that made them effectively independent. Universities are independent today. They're not governed by a king or a ruler or a wealthy benefactor because of Christianity. They allowed them to be independent, governed by their own governing board, and then that allowed them to study whatever they want, unconstrained by theology or secular powers. One more point I want to bring up is the idea of removing old taboos. Now, Christianity offered freedom from old ritualistic laws that are still present in other religions. For example, in Islam and Judaism, there are rules against touching dead bodies, and certain animals are prohibited, like pigs, for example. And Christian Europe lacked these restrictions, which led the way in dissection in human anatomy. So they say in this book, while the Greek and Roman avoidance of human dissection seems to have had roots in the belief that corpses were ritually unclean, early Christian culture broke definitively with the idea of corpse pollution, embracing tombs as holy places and the bodies of dead as objects of veneration and potential sources of magical and healing power. Now, what that basically means is they weren't scared to be around dead bodies. Early, they were just venerating them. They were hoping for healing powers, but over time, they just started to study these dead bodies. And then they developed dissection and advanced medical science. If you're a doctor watching this, this comes out of the Christian tradition. Toby E. Huff says, one can say that the Europeans, unlike Muslims, had in fact launched a program of empirical inquiry into the constitution of the human body, and parts of the inquiry necessitated dissecting human bodies. Conversely, post-mortem examinations for forensic purpose in the Islamic world were said to be strictly forbidden, as they were in China for different reasons. Not only was there an aversion to dissecting pigs as well as the human body, Islamic medicine education at the time was devoted to the memorization of texts. And to give a comparison and a contrast, this was the height of what the Islamic world was able to produce in terms of diagrams of anatomy. Meanwhile, Christianity advanced beyond this, and they were able to produce charts like this. They had a far better understanding of what was going on, and they were able to advance medical science in ways the other areas of the world simply could not. So, when we look at Christianity, we see that it gave rise to all very important doctrines here. And all of these doctrines were slowly borrowed into science, which is quite fascinating. And you know who noted this? Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche said, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as science without any presuppositions. A philosophy of faith must always be therefore, first of all, so that science can acquire from it a direction, a meaning, a limit, a method, a right to exist. We men of knowledge of today, we godless men and anti-metaphysicians, we too devour our flame from the fire ignited by a faith millennia old, the Christian faith. Now, just to reiterate, I'm not saying Christianity is the only thing that gave rise to science. As I said, Greek philosophy helped contribute, for sure. There were advances made in the Islamic world, as well as in the Hindu world, that Christians borrowed and used. But it's quite honest that it's quite clear that if this did not happen, we probably would not have gotten modern science as we now have it. We'd probably be centuries behind where we are now. So I think there's really important aspects that when Jesus said, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy, but I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. And I think that means multiple things, but I think it also includes that the glorious world of our luxuries, modern technology and advancements, if it wasn't for Jesus, we would not be here now. He came to make the world a better place. And one of the ways that has happened is through how Christian doctrine gave rise to modern science, and it turned us into a glorious utopia of technology, science, and advancements that the ancient mind could not even dream of. So with that, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take those.
Thanks very much, Michael. If you've just joined us, we're listening to Michael Jones on the subject of how Christianity shaped science. We've got a time for Q&A now.
Real quick, just so you know, in October, I'm going to have a full-length documentary on this topic that's going to cover even more, because I had to limit the ways Christianity helped science. There's even more I hadn't have time to put in the presentation. So there's even more I could cite.
Well, you managed to squeeze a huge amount into half an hour, so we're incredibly grateful for that. I wanted Michael because you didn't have time to unpack everything. I wanted just to come back, first of all, to your comment about Andrew Dickson White and John William Draper, who created the myth, if you like, of the Dark Ages being a time when science went backwards, didn't even stand still. And then we're all released and rescued by the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and so on. Can you just give us a bit of historical context for these two guys? When did they live? When did they write? And what was the pattern of their influence?
Yeah, well, they didn't really invent that idea. It does start to come about with the rise of the humanists in the early Renaissance, and then they just really they took it to another level and advanced. So these guys lived in the 1800s, and this was a period of a lot of dare I say, anti-Catholicism in Protestant Europe and America. So anything that could hurt the Catholic Church, a lot of people were for it. And this made the Catholic Church look bad. It made it kind of look like Protestantism sort of liberated humanity and brought us into a more enlightened era. So a lot of people were really for it. So I believe it was John Draper. He sort of wrote like a popular level book arguing this. And then White, he published another book that was the detailed account, and he had sources listed. He took a lot of things out of context, but it looked like he knew what he was talking about because he had all these sources. And so what Hutchings and Ingridiano say in their book of Popes and Unicorns is they sort of did like a pincer move. Like one attacked it on a popular level, one attacked it on an academic level, and they really sold this conflict thesis, the idea that Christianity and science were in conflict. And then atheists and deists really picked up their work. They started teaching it through academia in the 1900s, and it just became what everyone thinks. And historians have just been trying to address it since. Is that answer your question, or do you want more?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Really helpful. So Elliot Larson is asking here. He says Jackie traces the competition between science and magic back to Egyptian culture. over succeeding empires, magic wins out, attenuating scientific development. This was probably due to the capacity of magic to provide political influence. It was Christianity eventually that was able to overcome magic and allow sustained scientific development. And then the question he's asking, it says, doesn't this account allow us to push the controversy that you've outlined even back further into human history?
Yeah, you cannot actually put like a date on it. Like for sure. I mean, there's progress in all sorts of periods for sure. I mean, I would argue a lot of progress starts with the Torah for sure, moves up through the prophets, and then it really starts to explode and advance with Christianity and then the advancement of the church. But yeah, he's absolutely right. The church was against magic. Let me read this. This is from the Lombard Code of 643 AD. Now we're told in the Middle Ages they were all afraid of witches. They were running around and burning witches left and right. The Lombard Code of 643 AD states, "Let nobody presume to kill a foreign serving maid or female servant as a witch, for it is not possible or ought to be believed by crimes." In other words, if someone was saying, "I'm a witch," they're like, "No, you're not. That doesn't happen. Magic's not real." Okay, we know this. So they were not anti-witch. They thought it didn't happen. The witch trials came about through the modern era. It starts with the plague destroying and ravaging Europe, and then people got a little more superstitious after that. But prior to that, because of Christianity, they were not that superstitious. They were very much like, "Oh, no, we're against magic. Christianity has destroyed all this. The only power comes from God, not witches or warlocks or whatever."
True. Thank you. So Daniel O'Neill is asking, could biblical higher criticism, for example, Rudolf Boltmann, which proposes that God would never violate his natural laws and seek naturalistic or demythologized explanations of biblical stories and current miracles, could this be an application of extreme naturalism in the church? He's asking.
Oh, absolutely correct. It is definitely taking the whole idea to the extreme. You start with some good stuff, and then you just go to the radical extreme that God would never do that. And philosophically speaking, as someone who's trained in philosophy, that's not even a good understanding of how we should define miracles. They're not violations of natural laws. That comes from David Hume, and there's a great book called Hume's Abject Failure, written by John Ehrman, who is an atheist, and he's saying that Hume's understanding of miracles was absurd, but that filtered into the church, and yeah, it's extreme naturalism. It's a problem.
So Mark Strand is asking, excellent presentation, thank you. Please fast forward to the modern era and help me to understand two trends that have gone counter to your argument. One, fundamentalism in the 20th century, and secondly, neo-fundamentalism in the current generation, which challenges some accepted science and challenges scientific expertise.
Yeah. Good question. So in the book of Popes and Unicorns, one of the books I quoted, the last chapter deals with that more extensively. What they argue is that when the conflict thesis came out, atheists, secularists, naturalists really picked up the conflict thesis and pushed it throughout the 1900s hard. Really pushed it hard. Like, yeah, science and religion are at war. Science and religion are at war. And they say that eventually a lot of religious people were like, okay, if you're at war with us, fine, we're at war with you. And they created an artificial war between science and religion that shouldn't exist. And so religious people were sick and tired of scientists constantly attacking religion, that they started to push back, and they went into extreme fundamentalism. We actually see this. There's another great book called The Creationists by, what is his name? Ronald Numbers. Great book. He points out that creation is, like, if you go back 100 years, they were teaching evolution in a lot of the institutions, especially in the Bible Belt south of America. What happened, though, is that a lot of people started actually combining evolution with Nietzscheanism and Ubermensch theology, this kind of stuff. It scared a lot of Christians as well, and it pushed them into young earth creationism, which started to really come about in the 1960s because of a book published by John Wickham Jr. and Henry Morris called The Genesis Flood. Prior to that, there were very few young earth creationists outside of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So you have a combination of scientists pushing this war with birth religion conflict idea, creating an artificial conflict. Then you also have people taking the theory of evolution in the early 1900s, combining it with horrible things like Nietzschean Ubermensch ideas, things that gave rise to the Nazis, and people got spooked And of course, now we reject that today, but the lingering effects are still there. And it just sort of pushed a lot of Christians away from science, away from authorities who they don't trust. And so now we're trying to pick up the pieces and get everything back. That's one of the things I do on my channel, is trying to dispel those myths. I do a lot of stuff on showing that, you can be a Christian and believe in evolution. It's okay, guys. And I get a lot of really good testimonies out of that stuff.
You gave some fascinating accounts of people coming from a Christian worldview during the Dark Ages, so-called Dark Ages, and the contributions that they made. But of course, a lot of more contemporary scientists during the period of the Enlightenment and so on were Christian believers as well. I want to make a comment about that fact and how they didn't see any contradiction between their science and their faith, but rather saw their faith as a foundation for their science.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, they definitely, most scientists in the Enlightenment period were definitely of the idea that this is just completely and totally compatible. What we're doing is discovering nature. In fact, here's a quote from Nicholas Rupke in a book called Science and Religion: Historical Introduction. He notes that what he's saying in this quote is that there were deists and atheists that were trying to push back, and they believed in an eternal earth. So they believed in this old Aristotelian idea: the earth has always been here. It didn't need to be created, therefore it doesn't need a God. Scientists in the Enlightenment period, Christian scientists, use geology, use the study of the natural world to refute this idea and argue for Genesis, argue that the earth did have a beginning point. Nicholas Rupke says this: historical geology countered the eternalism of Enlightenment deism, and in particular, the theory of an eternal present expressed in the famous maxim of the Scottish naturalist James Hutton: we find no vestige of a beginning. So Christianity not only embraced geology, it used it to refute deistic ideas of an eternal earth. Now, the funny thing is, Rupke goes on to note that modern fundamentalists, young earth creationists, ended up using some of James Hutton's arguments today to argue for a young earth, to argue against modern historical geology. It's one of those ironies of history, is they're getting some of their arguments from people that were arguing against geology on the deistic, atheistic side. So it's just kind of one of those interesting facts of history. But yeah, Christians were all for in the Enlightenment period, arguing for science, using it because they thought they were using it to show that the scriptures were true.
You've outlined these 9 principles that Christianity has given, which provide a foundation for science. And you made the point several times that these principles don't come from other religious traditions. And particularly, I wonder if you'd comment on the role of Islam as a basis for modern science. Often what we hear from our Muslim friends is that science wouldn't exist without Islam. And yet those pictures of the anatomical understanding of human beings were really quite amazing, extraordinary. Tell us a little bit about Islam and the contribution it made to modern science compared with Christianity.
Oh yeah, if we're happy. This is the subject of Toby Huff's book, The Rise of Early Modern Science. He spent his career trying to figure out this question. Okay, the Islamic world was actually more advanced at one point than Europe. Why didn't modern science come out of Islam? It should have came out of the Middle East, yet it came out of Christian Europe. And he has spent his career answering that question. And what he basically comes to in his book, and he's on like the 3rd edition now, he said what he comes to in his book is that Islam did not have the separation of church and state. It never allowed science to develop into its own institution. The foreign sciences, as they called them in Islam, were different than the Islamic sciences: study of hadith, study of fiqh, study of the Quran. Those were called the Islamic sciences, and the foreign sciences were everything else. In the Islamic world, the foreign sciences were only useful so far as they helped the Islamic sciences. So we can develop trigonometry so we can figure out the direction of Mecca so we know the direction to pray. All right, we figured it out. No more trigonometry. Throw it out. We don't need it anymore. That was the problem. They only used science to help advance Islam. Once they were done, they discarded it. That's why we have an Islamic golden age where they were doing this stuff. And then the next generations didn't feel the need to do anything with it. And so that was the main problem. Meanwhile, in Christian Europe, they devoured anything they could get from the outside world, and they advanced and built on it. Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes in the West, he was basically rejected by most of the Islamic world. Very not really well read. In fact, he was dragged before the court in Cordoba, I believe it was. It was in Islamic Spain at the time, and he was asked, "Are you reading Aristotle?" He had to lie and say, "No, I've never even read Aristotle," because they were so anti reading the foreign sciences. Meanwhile, his works, Ibn Rushd's works, flourished throughout Europe. Aristotle flourished throughout Europe. So Islam did help advance science in ways, but it also limited it and prevented it from becoming its own thing or ever really advancing beyond Islam. So yeah, you could point to advances in the Islamic world, but it didn't give rise to modern science. This comes out of the Christian tradition and the specific doctrines I cited for a reason.
Thank you. Coming back to Aristotle again, David Firth is asking here, how important do you think was the role of Thomas Aquinas? He really seemed to bring Aristotle back into discussions among theologians and philosophers. His constant appeal to reason has made an enormous impact to subsequent generations trying to work out the nature of God and the world.
Yeah, good point. Thomas Aquinas was primarily a theologian. But what Thomas Aquinas really did help is the church prior to Aquinas was really concerned about Aristotle, because there was still this old idea that, that we kind of lack today, which is the ancient Greek philosophers must be revered. Whereas today we're like, okay, they were great, but we've made so many more advances. We know why they were wrong. But in the medieval period, it was very like, okay, ancient learning, this is something that needs to be highly praised. How do we rectify this with Christian doctrine? And the church was really struggling with that. Aquinas showed how Christian doctrine and Aristotelian logic, Aristotelian thinking could be easily rectified. And that allowed more what's the word I'm looking for? A more favor towards Aristotle. People were more willing to read it and study it when they realized this wasn't a problem. And so it opened up and allowed more people to build on Aristotle to make scientific advances.
So lots of good comments coming through. Lauren Bickle says, thanks so much, Michael. As a young believer in Christ, Princeton undergrad in the 70s, majoring in history and philosophy of science, now an MD, I loved seeing how great scientists like Boyle, Newton, and Hall praised and glorified God because of everything they discovered. Humility, so much pride and self-glory in our modern science society with a godless worldview. So really just a comment there.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then Katerina Osipova is asking, I've heard that many of the most important discoveries in medicine were made by Christians. Is this true? Any examples that you could give?
Yes. So this is definitely, as I was talking about earlier, with the rise of dissection, everyone was sort of like had these old taboos about bodies. We don't want to look at bodies. They're sacred or they're forbidden. And then Christianity opened that up. They started dissecting pigs early on, which was forbidden in the Islamic world and the Jewish world, for example. And then they moved on to dissecting actual bodies. And then, they started making advances in medicine. Most of the advances we see in medicine, at least leading up to with the past few decades, have been made by Christians, for sure, throughout the 1900s, 1800s, 1700s. This all comes out of Christian ideas, and there are advances in medicine, especially through studying the body and dissection, which was a huge Christian idea. That came out. People bring up Leonardo da Vinci, for example, and they'll say, well, the church prevented Leonardo da Vinci from dissecting. Look at how anti-science they were. Leonardo da Vinci was not a trained physician. He was an artist. Imagine if you had a neighbor who was an artist and he was dissecting bodies in his basement. You'd call the cops too. You'd be like, no, that's got to be. That was their problem with Leonardo doing this, is that he wasn't a trained scientist or doctor. So they were against him doing it because he didn't have the medical certifications to do it. But they were not against dissecting bodies. They just wanted it to be done in a proper medical environment.
A lot of people are asking, you gave us so many brilliant references and books that will be unfamiliar, I think, to most of the people watching this video today. And asking, is it possible to get a bibliography? And yes, when we write to you tomorrow, we will give you a list of the books that were obtained and or mentioned and quoted in the presentation. Colin Slater is saying he notes the independence and freedom of universities and research while a Christian worldview prevailed, and the loss of these under the modern liberal religion of secularism. There are areas that are no-go areas now of research, it seems, and particularly in medicine around things like abortion or transgender, all of that kind of stuff. Would you like to comment, just enlarge a little bit on the how the first universities were given independence in research and in teaching, and how that relates to
Yeah.
worldview?
Yeah, so Toby Huff talks about this in his book, and he notes that Christians really started to develop this idea of like collective bargaining, this idea that you can have representation separate from like the church or the state that you can use to go in and do things. So, like we see guilds starting to form throughout the medieval period. And then, of course, you get guilds of intellectuals that start their own universities. And they say, we want our own governing board and we want to do things our way. And we're not going to be governed by a pope. We're not going to be governed by a king. We're going to do things we want to do. And because Christianity had the separation of church and state, popes, bishops were like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you can, we'll focus on the godly matters, forgiveness of sins, giving of the Eucharist. You guys can focus on whatever you want to do in studying the world and natural world and that kind of stuff. So yeah, very much comes out of that idea. And Toby Huff actually talks about in his book that this also gave rise to early forms of parliamentary rule, democracy, these kinds of things are all coming out of the Christian tradition. It's actually quite fascinating how much Christianity contribute to so many of our modern ideas and how we think. Again, Toby Huff's book is really fascinating in that. And also, Tom Holland notes this in his book Dominion as well. Similar ideas as well in terms of the collective bargaining and the forming of guilds and independent organizations. And the intellectuals were like, yeah, we want to do that too. And that's how universities came about.
You gave a fascinating quote from Nietzsche at the end. Nietzsche, no friend of Christianity, but saying that Christianity was really the basis of modern science in many ways. Yet you also, when you were talking about White and Draper early on, you said that their ideas are now largely discredited by historians. Could you comment a bit about people coming from a non-Christian worldview as historians or scientists, and what they say about the Christian origins of science? I mean, is there a general recognition of the importance of the 9 principles you've outlined as being important for the formation of science?
Among lay people, no. Among historians of science, yes. I mean, historians of science, atheist or Christian, will agree with what I've said here today, as far as I can tell. And I've talked to like James Ungadiano, who looked over my script for this, my presentation. He says, yeah, he's had me change a couple things here and there, just sort of adjust it. But lay people, they tend to think, no, Christianity was not crucial for science. They say these things just came out of human intellect and reason, just developing throughout the eras. You can't give it Christianity science. And my retort is, no, you have to. It was very helpful. So that needs to be considered. And here's what I would tell people if you're watching this. People love a good story. People love the conflict thesis because it's a good story. You have religion, bad, science, light, and they're fighting, and you get to be on the light side. And people don't want to give up that good story. So you got to give them a better story. And the better story is that, Christianity was fighting against all sorts of darknesses throughout the ancient world, the medieval world, and look at how it gave rise to this beautiful thing we call science. So this is something we see in psychology. People don't want to give up a good story, and they tend to build a lot of beliefs around stories they have in their own life. That's why the conflict thesis continues on, especially among a lot of lay people, because it tells a good story. And you combat them by telling them the real story of how Christianity was the light that gave rise to science.
Mm-hmm. Well, as the Bible would say, telling people what their itching ears long to hear to back up their confirmation bias, I guess. I just wanted finally to pick up this question of complicated theology, your seventh point. And you talked about elements of Christianity that are very difficult to understand, for which we have to make up extra words like incarnation or Trinity and so on. And it just made me wonder, we know that with the advancement of science, the theories in a sense become more complicated as we come on. We had Newton with his laws of motion, and then Einstein came along with his theory of relativity, and we realized the world was much more complex than it is. Now with string theory and so on. Islam, by contrast, much more one-dimensional with its theology.
Mhm.
There's no concept of Trinity, no concept of incarnation, and so on. Do you think there's a link there between the complicated theology of Christianity opening people's minds more to the complexities of, the nature of the universe and things being more complicated than we might have imagined at first sight?
Yeah, that's definitely important because if you think God is a Trinity, you're going to start thinking beyond your mind about what is possible. And how can God be fully, how can God be fully man and fully God in the incarnation? You got to open your mind more. And again, we kind of see, like, I'm not saying there's a direct connection, but we do see similar things in like quantum mechanics. So particles, a wave, and a particle. How do you get from a wave function to collapse? These are complicated things, and so it does. When you need to have a more open mind to develop something like quantum mechanics. And of course, Christian Europe did give rise to that idea. In Islam, it was complete opposite. It was very much, especially in Islam, it's this idea that God has given us a perfect book of guidance we call the Quran. What more do we need? Why do we need to study more? We have the Quran. It's the perfect guidance. This is why people like Ibn Rushd were being persecuted, because they were going beyond what the Quran allowed or said. And there's the word innovator in Arabic was often termed for heretic, as Toby Huff points out in his book. Like, to be an innovator was a bad thing in Islam. It's the exact opposite in Christian Europe. So, I mean, yeah, I would recommend people read that book if you want to know more about how Islam held back science and how Christianity got us out of those constraints.
Brilliant. So we've basically run out of time. Just one last question on book recommendation. Jan Kanini is asking, would you recommend Galileo Goes to Jail as a good starter book for an atheist anatomy professor who's fallen from a strong Christian childhood background? And any other recommendations in terms of books to give non-Christian friends who are grappling with these issues?
That would be probably the first book I'd go to. Yeah, that's a good book because each chapter is precise and it's one different author. You can read those quickly. Another really good book would be Of Popes and Unicorns, Science, Christianity, and How the Conflict Thesis Fooled the World. So I would say those two books would be the really good starter books for that. Of Popes and Unicorns does cover a lot of the history of the conflict thesis. And then Galileo Goes to Jail covers the myths that they delve into. And you'll see in Of Popes and Unicorns, they do cite Galileo Goes to Jail a lot and build on what they say there.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, it's a great recommendation. Sadly, we've run out of time. We've got more questions and we could go on for some time, Michael. But we're incredibly grateful to you for your time, for your expertise, for your research. And we're very conscious too that we're just seeing the very tip of a huge iceberg of stuff that's available on your website, in particular through your YouTube channel, and we hope that you will be able to make use of that and particularly pass it on to other Christian medics and dentists, people in your churches around the world who may not be aware of this fantastic resource that's there. So, Michael, thanks very much again. And finally, just thank you to all of you for coming along today. Keep spreading the word. We'll be back again soon with ICMDA webinars next week. All the detail is on the website. Go there and book and let the word be known. May the Lord bless you. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.